you mentioned demographics earlier on, and we've talked about big visions as well, and it reminded me of the podcast we did right at the start of the year, I think, was it? At the Phoenix Group headquarters at Standard Life House. And Phoenix Group, as we know, are sponsoring today's podcast as well. I think Kes Dugdale did that podcast. This is the third former leader we've mentioned today, I think.
There's no shortage of them.
No,
I think second forward.
But there, and I think the research that Phoenix Group has done has produced two very interesting things. One is about long-term savings and therefore later life care, and the massive gap there is in what people are saving, and effectively the sort of deferred poverty that we've got of people who think they're saving enough for older age when they're in maybe their 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s, but actually they've got a massive gap, and that's deferred poverty that's going to require state intervention in years to come. But then they also have done a lot of research on carers in particular. About 1 in 9 of the workforce are carers, and because of demographics, people of my sort of age in the 40s are actually double caring for children at one end, caring for parents at the other end. And I think there's evidence that there's multiple people every day are dropping out of the workforce completely because of caring duties. Now, all these things actually contribute to a big part of the NHS problem. But they're things that they can't be fixed in 1 year before an election. So these are long-term, we talked about the sort of vision that you need to put forward for what does Scotland look like. So, that's a typical example of a big vision piece that needs 25 or 50 years. Is that what we're looking at you producing?
Yeah. So we have been talking about this for more than 25 years. When I was first in government, there were dire warnings about what would happen. There would be a population explosion of older people. We needed to put things in place. That simply hasn't happened. It's been ignored. That long-term vision and planning has not happened. We have to do that. That's why some of the things we're saying round about GPs is about making sure that primary care and social care are more joined up and are funded appropriately. So the stat I would give you is at the start of devolution, primary care was 11% of the health budget. It's now 6%, and they're having to do so much more. So what we need, if I was to think about my own old age, right, but genuinely, it is about...
A young woman yet, Jack.
Thank you, Anas, right? However, right, getting serious for a moment, it is about what are my housing options going to be? We've stopped building enough houses. We don't have enough sheltered or very sheltered accommodation. So there's no incentive for people to step down from, big family homes down to accommodation that's more appropriate. We are squeezing the life out of care homes at the moment. There's no agreement on the care home contract. We've got local authorities having to save because the SNP cut their budget for social care. So we've got a real ticking time bomb going on. And unless we reverse that, and unless we treat social care in the same way as we regard the NHS, that's not going to resolve itself. So we need to get planning at a local level, right across the whole system, because if we don't do that prevention work now, then we aren't going to be able to run the NHS the way it is before. So people with long-term conditions, we pick them up too late. Screening programs that you can identify problems and then put people into, adequate healthcare is what we need to do if we don't want them ending up in hospital too soon. That's how we do it. It's that long-term preventative approach rooted in communities that is going to be so important, because the NHS won't cope if we do nothing. And that, unfortunately, is what the SNP has not done over the years.
Wes Streeting, your counterpart, said more than I've ever heard any opposition health spokesperson say before the election, said a lot of things that people in the health industry didn't want to hear. Are you going to say a lot of things that people in the health industry don't want to hear for the next year as well, because they have to be done?
My priority is patients and patient outcomes. I want to work with the NHS because we've got some great people in it to deliver on those patient outcomes. But that's the thing that has to change. We cannot continue to be a sick nation. We need people to be healthy, to be well, because they then contribute to the economy. We need to do all of that to have a purpose. But people have huge regard for the NHS. The staff work incredibly hard, but doing more of the same isn't going to make people better.
Jackie is always polite. Right. And,
not in private.
When she, indeed, but when we talk about reforming our health boards and
Yeah.
taking on the bureaucrats and the managers, let's be really clear, we are going to make people uncomfortable. And people need to be made uncomfortable because right now we are rewarding failure, we are not rewarding success. And we're going to be seeing a lot more about that at conference at the weekend and what we mean by meaningful fundamental reform to the NHS. That is going to be difficult for some people to hear, but it's important that we say it. But on the broader point, I think you're right, it's about reforming our health and social care system, but actually it's also about reforming our skills and labour market as well. Because the world of work is fundamentally changed and changing. Whereas before in our parents' generation, they might have worked 3 or 4 jobs in their lives. So therefore they kind of stayed in the same sector, but maybe worked 3 or 4 jobs. And therefore the adaptability of the skills system, lifelong learning wasn't as important. It's now predicted that this generation will work 6 or 7 jobs in their lives. And actually the next generation is going to work 12 to 14 jobs in their lives. That places huge burden on our schools, our colleges, universities, but actually on employers, because employers are going to invest their energy in workers, have them for 3 or 4 years, and then they're going to move on. They're going to have to do it all again. So we have to rewire our skills and our labour market as well. And again, we'll be seeing much more about that at conference in the coming days. Big structural reform to make a meaningful difference.
Interesting. We'll listen out for that. I want us to turn to the case of Sandy Peggy, a nurse, and Beth Upton, a trans doctor. So, for those who may not have been following the case, Miss Peggy objected to having to share the changing room at Victoria Hospital, which is part of NHS Fife, with Dr Upton, a trans woman. Sandy Peggy was then suspended. She claims her treatment amounted to unlawful harassment under the Equality Act, and so Sandy Peggy took NHS Fife, and indeed Dr Upton, to tribunal, which has completed its first phase. I suppose my first question here is really, do you support Nurse Sandy Peggy?
I absolutely do. I think we have consistently said that we would protect single-sex spaces based on men and women, based on biological sex, and NHS Fife didn't do that. Now, at the end of the day, I'm very clear. The Equality Act is very clear about what should have happened in this circumstance. And what I can't get over is neither Neil Gray nor John Swinney seem to want to do anything about this. And my bottom line is the NHS should be about treating patients. That's the only focus that they should have. And I think this is incredible that what we are gripped by as a nation isn't the deficit that NHS Fife is facing, isn't the kind of waiting times at their A&E, but is somebody feeling uncomfortable because a trans doctor used their space.
Yeah. I suppose then my next question, based on what you've just said, is it's really very easy, is it not, to draw the line between your support for Nicola Sturgeon's Gender Recognition Reform Bill and this exact situation?
So, Calum, look, we've been really open about this already, is that looking back and reflecting on the process of the GRR bill, and this is on you, I've said this several times before, is I think looking back, the deep regret that we have is that actually we didn't push harder on the amendments that we had as conditions for supporting the bill. And we took at face value the Scottish Government when they on the record said that nothing in the legislation would negatively interact with the Equality Act, that they would respect single-sex spaces based on biological sex. But also, third, remember, the GRR Act has not actually been enacted because of the negative interaction with the Equality Act, but this is still happening right now in Scotland. And the reason why it's happening, actually, is I think there's an element of organisational capture, and I think there is a bit of overreach from government.
Isn't there fear in these public places, like in the NHS, that because of the indication, because of the signal that was sent from the Scottish Parliament on this legislation,
there is an element of
they don't know
capture.
what they're doing?
There's an element of organisational capture. But the key point here, it goes back to what Jackie said right at the start, is throughout and now, and this will always be the case, we will support single-sex spaces based on biological sex, and that is spaces and services, crucially NHS services as well. And I think where there's a frustration is, this isn't just about a government issuing guidance and then a health board choosing to either follow a guidance or not follow a guidance or interpret a guidance. This is about following the law.
The actual law.
And the Equality Act is very clear. So this actually undermines the argument which is around how do we challenge transphobia and how do we make sure we are also challenging misogyny and sexism at the same time, because there's a failure to respect the Equality Act and there is not robust action from government. Government actually were notified about this and didn't take the meaningful action. So we've got to, if we are going to stop falling into divisive culture war politics, if we are going to make sure we're making progress as a nation, then we've got to say quite clearly we support single-sex spaces based on biological sex. We respect the Equality Act. So as I've already said, like we should have been much tighter in terms of the conditionality in our support based on our amendments. Our amendments were not supported. We believed them at face value when they said that, and they actually said on the record, and people can go back and look at this, is the reason why this does not need to be put on the face of the bill, either the single-sex basis based on biological sex, or the Equality Act amendment, was they said because the transcript of the debate is clear, that will give the legal protections that are required rather than actually putting them in the face of the bill. That proved not to be the case when it went to the court, and it did negatively interact with the Equality Act, and we believe in the primacy of the Equality Act. That's the argument.
So if you'd known what you know now, you would have opposed everything.
Knowing what we know now, we would not have supported the bill.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I suppose just to add to that, and I've got a couple of thoughts here. So this is from Ali, one of our followers on X. Given what we've heard in this tribunal, would you adopt a policy which protects female rights and also seeks to help those with gender identity issues and dysphoria, which I think you're kind of alluding to? But then there is this slight contradiction, because at your party's conference last year, delegates voted down a motion which had called for it to acknowledge the principle of women's sex-based rights. It seems foggy to me. Is that my ignorance?
Well, again, we had a frustration about what happened at conference last year, and Jackie can
trying to work out how you untangle this in time for an election next year, when, as we say, the case of Sandy Peggy and Dr. Upton has brought it right into the forefront again.
Well, we've set the frame, and Jackie, on you go.
Yes. I mean, we are very clear. We have a consistent position. I think what you were seeing is conference being pulled in different ways by different interests, trying to come to a conclusion about something. But we are very clear. And as somebody who I hope to be in a position to implement things through the NHS, I am abundantly clear about what the purpose of the NHS is. Yeah. And therefore, both in terms of treatment of staff and services, we will respect biological sex. We've been clear about that. That's what we intend to do.
Really interesting. It's a really helpful conversation to have, I think, given the prescience of all of this.
So do you see this as a potential dividing line then between you and the Scottish Government to actually much more actively push that single-sex space issue and push women's and girls' rights? I mean, there's been murmurings of, for example, a party being formed around pushing women's and girls' rights, which might hurt you guys. Do you see this as something where you can actively distinguish between you and the government on what you think about this?
Where I think there is a clear dividing line, and this, I think, comes to the priorities argument, is I think what's happened under this current SNP government is, because they don't have the answers to the big challenges facing the country, is that they are picking topics to try and make progress in other routes. What I would say is, if we're going to make big progress in Scotland to breach the inequality gap, we've got to fix the NHS, our education system, our skill system, the labour market, and get the investments we need, and housing emergency, because all of those things break down inequality and create a more equal and fairer society. But I think there has been an overreach. There's an overreach in this case. I also think if you look at what's happening around some of the intrusive questions that are being asked in some of our schools with some of the surveys, it's gone too far. And I think rather than focusing on those issues, we're going to have a government that focuses on, like, what's going to keep me awake at night and what's going to keep me going every day is not going to be sex surveys in schools. We're going to stop the sex surveys in schools. It's not going to be big identity questions. It's going to be, how do we fix the NHS? How do we clear the backlogs? How do we get our economy working? How do we get investment into our country? How do we fix our skills system? How do we deliver that new direction in every part of our public policy, pushing power to our local communities? That's what we're going to focus on. We're not going to get into what I think has become a really unfortunate kind of focus on those niche issues rather than the big issues that are confronting our country. What's keeping people awake at night? Their granny can't get an operation, or they can't get a care place. Their child can't get into a college or university place. They can't get a job that's going to meet their financial needs. That's what's keeping people awake at night, and that's what we're going to confront.
I suppose then my final question, with all that we've discussed on the podcast, and we're so grateful that you're here, is who will be your coalition partners to deliver all of this, Jackie?
We won't need them.
Do you think?
We are going out to win every single vote. No. Listen, just remember, the application's on digital. It's not in the post, it's digital, right? But genuinely, we are going to work really, really hard for every single vote. We go into this election to win, not to think about who will be our coalition partners. And actually, because we will have the right policies on the NHS, on education, on the economy, even, Geoff, on energy, we will absolutely work hard to deliver.
There's no doubt that Reform UK would broaden your appeal, though, wouldn't it, Alex?
They have 0 MSPs, and I do not believe the polls are going to stay the way they are. And the choice people are going to face in the election, and I believe we will win the election in May 2026. I believe we were going to win the general election. People thought I was deluded when I said we were going to win the election in July 2024. We proved people wrong. I've proved pollsters wrong before, I've proved polls wrong before, and we're going to prove them wrong again in May 2026. Because fundamentally, if people across the country accept that our country's going in the wrong direction, if they want to end 20 years of SNP misrule, then the only party that can replace them, and the only party that can chart a new direction for our country, is the Scottish Labour Party and me as First Minister. That's the argument we're going to make. That's the argument I believe we're going to win. And Geoff might even join the Scottish Labour Party in the process.
Anna Sarwar, Jackie Bailey, thank you both.
My pleasure, thank you.
Great to see you.